I, for one, however, am perfectly fine with the current control setup where I can, recline on a couch and play my games rather than having to sit perfectly still and not not worry about the slightest twitch of my hand sending my character hurtling all over the place. I like just sitting in my recliner, holding my controller, and letting things go. So I don't see how this is, in fact, better. It's possibly better in his own opinion. However, this does not lead to a convincing argument. As mine does not necessarily make a great argument, I'm just saying how it can be turned against him, and how my opinions differ from him, thus making this article a moot point. Moving on. Migrating to this kind of control scheme highlights some of the most ignoble qualities in shooter design, which we've become overly accustomed to in the last decade. I will agree with that. Foremost among these is the volume and duration of shootouts. In an average shooter, you'll kill hundreds of polygon muppets en route to the final cutscene. Depth and variety is alleged to come from tweaking the enemy composition and area design in which these bullet filibusters take place. Well, that's kind of how first-person shooters have always been. Even going back to Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, that's kind of all they ever really were. I mean, Red Steel and Conduit were the exact same thing you're complaining about here, so I don't know what you're really saying. I think this is more of a Let's Buy Red Steel 2 article rather than an actual journalistic thing so far. Oh, good, he's actually mentioning this next. Games like Red Steel, The Conduit, Medal of Honor Heroes 2, and the Call of Duty ports embody this conceptual divide, throwing players into absurdly gamey shootouts against 50 or 60 enemies while offering them a weighted and non-productive interface to attack with. In that light, it's a bit Crumedgianly? I'm sorry, that's a word I have never seen before, to suggest that it's a Wii hardware that's at fault for the ridiculous nature of gameplay. I immediately take back that point I just gave him for saying that it's not the Wii's hardware. It is, in fact, the Wii's hardware for not being precise and not having a good user interface in the first-person shooters. Yes, I will agree with you that first-person shooters on other systems can be equally as dull and monotonous. However, at least those games are playable and I don't have to physically think about controlling what's going on screen. The best games I find are ones where you don't have to think about actually playing the game. This is why games like Mario and Sonic were incredibly popular back in the day, because even my parents, playing them for the first time, knew exactly how to play because it was so intuitive and simple. Having the Wii pointer, yes, that's pretty obvious how it would work, however, it does not work the way it is supposed to, so yes, I would blame the Wii's hardware limitations. Supposedly, I assume he's going to go and highlight Red Steel 2 for having the Motion Plus, however, it's kind of a moot point considering I only know of 2 other games that are using the damn peripheral. Moving on. Games have been designed around this absurd non-realism for years. Adding productive convenience to that simplistic approach to play makes it easier to avoid thinking about how absurd it all is. But how is that supposed to be considered a pro? With aiming more precise but movement more difficult, the boilerplate for Space Nazi whack-a-mole suddenly feels fake. Then so much the better. It is a dishonest and unimaginative way to approach game design. Again, you are assuming too much. There are plumbers killing Koopas and blue hedgehogs running absurdly fast. And you're saying it's unimaginative game design to just, shoot people. Hello, we've been shooting people since basically the first video games. I mean, hell, fucking, Space Invaders involved you shooting people, and that was 1980. The pointer controls in Wii shooters can't be separated from the gesture controls, which offer a second layer of environmental immersion. Few developers bother to do much with gestural control beyond replacing button pushes with single, defined swipes that are often dismissed as technical gimmickry, which they are. In Red Steel, you had to physically shove doors open with the hand downward push of the nunchuck. In Metroid Prime 3, you had to guide Samus's finger over the individual buttons of the keyboard to enter a code. Those were technical gimmicks, so I don't know what he's saying here. In Call of Duty 3, you had the remote and nunchuck up and made rowing gestures to pedal across a besieged river. In Red Steel 2, you twist the Wii remote to hack old-fashioned saves. In other games, these are automated commands that happen with the press of a button. And what's wrong with that, I really wonder. Making them more physically demanding elicits peals of scorn from experienced gamers because it makes object interactions a part of the main gameplay and is an interactive distraction from the shooting spree. No, they're problems because they're boring and they really don't add anything to the realism. It creates some pointless gestures that you don't necessarily need. I mean, imagine if they made a Mario game where you had to flick up and down the remotes all the time to make Mario run. Sure, it would add more immersion because you have more control over how fast he's running, however, it does not lead to good game design. We finally move on to page 2. While gesture controls are often bluntly implemented and adorned by any game-like progression of their own, they add a new and remarkable layers of awareness to thoughtless action. What better description of a game could there be? Not so long ago, the mundane button press we'd been using to open garage doors, turn on blenders, and multiply numbers was transformed into a dramatic jump over a bottomless chasm for the sake of saving a woman from a monster. Many players groan at the thought of flicking a piece of plastic to open a door to reload a pistol. That's only because these actions are still treated as mundane parts of game design, which they are. They're thoughtless and functional, designed for efficiency instead of inefficient play. Again, I have to wonder what he is arguing with this. I like the nunchuck to eject an empty magazine from my handgun in red steel. I like the suggestion that the objects I interact with have a sense of weight, and I like adding complication to previously taken for granted things. It adds challenge. How? Requires thought, again, how? And is as playful as it could be. The question with the often simple and poorly tuned gestural controls in Wii games is not that they exist, that they don't go far enough. Again, I would argue the opposite. We don't need actual object interaction for things like doors, opening saves, or reloading. We don't need to. It doesn't really add anything to the game other than adding more pointless controls that really we haven't really needed. I mean, I don't really want to have to flick the nunchuck every time I need to reload. A button press is perfectly adequate, thank you. You're still replacing button controls with motion gimmicks. I don't want to just flick out an empty magazine. I'd also like to use the pointer and remote to pick out a fresh magazine. Line up the edges with the underside of the gun handle, flick upwards to put it in, and then swipe again to make sure the chamber is clear. Again, I find that absolutely pointless and makes it artificially difficult. I really don't want to spend half of my time in a gunfight making sure my gun is loaded correctly. Moving on. That would necessitate gunfights be slowed down and enemy numbers be lessened, but it would also encourage added care by making each bullet more prized commodity because of how long it takes to load them. Or you could just give them less ammo, hence the Resident Evil survival horror genre. So that's kind of a moot point, considering there are games with plenty of scarce ammo, thus making every bullet actually worth it. Simply making it harder to reload does not make every bullet more valuable, it just annoys the fuck out of the player because I spend so damn long to reload. Each one of the steps of loading a gun can carry its own game-like systems of win or lose that rely on the analog sensitivity of the accelerometers, like a cross between a marble dropping game and a Wii Fit and an active reload system in Gears of War. The pressure of doing this in a frantically chosen cover spot with bullets whizzing and enemies readjusting their own positions would add a tremendous sense of drama to scenarios that have become predictable and familiar. No, it would just make them more annoying because you have to spend so much time reloading and thus worrying about your inventory than the guy who's trying to blow your fucking face off. Not to mention, why would the enemies be able to reload just as quickly? It kind of makes the whole thing moot. Moreover, this drama would come from making a superhuman seem slightly more human. Why would we want to play as normal humans? The reason we play games is to play as superhumans, but that's belaboring the point. Moving on. For years, game design has evolved into two dimensions, with designers fixated on what was represented on television screens and computer monitors. The method of interaction was taken as a relative constant, while only the variety of technical representation of the fantasies were allowed to grow. The Wii is a modest attempt to match the relative sophistication of appearances on the screen with an appropriate evolution of sophisticated play input. The last few years have been an unformed wallow of modest experiment and technical failure. You can say the same thing about the NES and their move to the richer narrative elements and interactive worlds. No, the difference between the Wii and the NES is that the NES was the first home console to actually standardize game controls. The Atari 2600 just basically had a joystick and a button, and the many imitators had so many different controls it was up the ass. The NES had one controller that everyone had to use for the system, and because it was so popular, everyone got used to it. That's why the NES worked. The problem with the Wii is that the technical limitations cause it to not work as well as it should, and the fact that there are equally competent competitors using completely different control schemes, but the problem with those control schemes is that everyone already knows how to play them as long as you're at least a gamer. So the fact that it's technical limitations and people are used to other control schemes is what's making it harder, and the fact that developers are not really getting the hang of it. They know how to design a certain way. I suppose it could be good once they learn how to design for the Wii, however they haven't yet, so I'm still dismissing this argument. There were just as many Pac-Man and Asteroids fans who rolled their eyes at Contra and Castlevania as there are now Call of Duty and Bioshock fans who look at Red Steel and Metroid Prime 3 as incompetent and annoying younger brothers.